So in the spirit of continuing to begin to enter this field of understanding disasters, let's keep talking about some big ideas here. So a recap of last week, real briefly, was a hazard is a risk. And then once that risk manifests itself and has some impact on us or our infrastructure or whatever, that's when we call it a disaster. We mentioned last time that the bureaucracy can be thick and really complicated. We have various terminology that we deploy for this and everything. But we said we're going to boil most of this down to the simple thing, which is emergency, disaster, catastrophe. Emergency is affecting me and my house. Let's say my house burns down. That's a true problem, but it's just me or my immediate family kind of thing, right? A disaster is going to impact many people in my community, right? And then a catastrophe is something that's going to affect, a whole region, a whole society kind of thing, right? So again, there are different frameworks that have a much more sophisticated breakdown, but for us, that's good enough for us. Emergency, me; disaster, us; catastrophe, the whole county, the whole state kind of thing. Okay. I think it's also important to say that a lot of times throughout this class, we're going to be talking about these big picture things, but it's also important to remind ourselves that these things are happening to individuals, happening to people that are experiencing these. And even though sometimes I'll be using sort of broad generalities or big picture numbers and stuff, it's important to keep in mind that this is, real people in real places are dealing with the consequences of these challenges. And that's a funny cartoon that maybe you guys don't find funny. Okay, all right. So keeping going forward now. This is how we broad big picture in the Western world, how we've kind of thought about disasters. So back in the day, for most of our history as a species, when the volcano would go off, when the ground would shake, we would attribute that to an so-called act of God, right? So something beyond our control, something of another world, it's uncontrollable, natural forces. We can't even understand why the volcano went off. We don't even know how the ground could possibly shake unless God, threw a lightning bolt down or did whatever, right? So most of our human history, these things are caused, we think, by a deity or something like that. Then by the late 19th and the 20th century, we start this term natural disaster. And this is a serious disruption of our regular routine, or regular everyday functioning that strikes without warning. So we're beginning to kind of understand what's going on, but we can't predict it. It just sort of happens, right? But we're kind of starting to understand, okay, so when the winds blow a certain way, that kind of tends to make it more likely to be a thing that would become a tropical storm, that would become a hurricane, but we still can't, we don't know why it's hitting this particular place at this particular time, that kind of thing. So act of God first, then this era of natural disasters. And today, while we still have that natural disasters framework, we've gotten much more sophisticated at understanding the drivers behind most, if not all, of these events. So we understand why the volcano erupts. We understand why the hurricane strikes Florida so often and things of that nature. But our current view is, again, less of a natural quote-unquote disaster and more seeing disasters, at least as they're manifest, as a form of the Anthropocene, a form of something that we have agency over. We're impacting in some way, shape, or form through our choices and our decisions. And so this idea, we still use the term natural disaster because it's a convenient shorthand and everybody uses it, but it's really more like a natural hazard that interacts with our human-dominated planet, with the Anthropocene. And that's how we are increasingly viewing these disasters these days. So act of God, natural disaster, and then disaster as a function of the Anthropocene. Okay, this is the Sendai disaster framework. This is the most updated version. This is a United Nations document. And this is to govern us in our thinking about broad pictures of disasters for the next decade or so. And if you look at this, there's a whole framework here, right? So we look at the top, and everything's broken down and organized into different subcategories. We talked a little bit about this last time. I am highlighting the things we'll talk about in our class. So we don't have enough time to go over every single possible thing here, right? And so these are the ones that we will focus on, and in particular. What happened to my other? I thought I had another slide in there. So in particular, we're not going to talk about active human violence on other humans, generally speaking. So war, intentional release of disease and stuff like that, that can have a lot of similarities. It can have some interactions with disasters, and indeed could be considered a disaster by some. But we're not going to talk about those things, right? So. Bhopal, India, the release of essentially the breakdown of the management of this chemical plant releases a bunch of gas and kills thousands of Indian citizens near the plant. That is absolutely a disaster, but we're mostly going to focus on the natural stuff, not the sort of human on human types of things. Okay, make sense? Okay. So next activity. So. In the announcements today before class, I sent out a link, and one was to a few things, but one of them was to this shared Google Sheet. So we're gonna start working on that now. And so here's the idea. The idea is this terminology is non-trivial. Terminology is important, right? And we don't just say that because I'm an academic and I like to write papers that say the definition of blah 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 is blah blah blah. It's because it influences how people think, right? And so, we're going to do two questions. We're going to start with the first one. So we're just going to focus on the first one right now. But our question is: do we associate certain disasters, certain types of things, with certain places? And so, more specifically, do we associate certain places with bad things happening? Okay. So to do this, I've assigned everybody. Let's see, do I have it in here? Yeah, okay, so I've assigned everybody, and this is on the first tab of the page. You don't have to look at it yet. We'll look at it in a second. But the first tab is what we're going to work on initially. And so everybody has an act of God and a natural disaster, and then something else, flood, hurricane, something like that, okay? So here's what I want you to do. So I don't want you to just go to your browser and start typing stuff immediately. Most of you guys are ESRM majors, and so you look at environmental stuff and all that jazz. I don't want any of that memory, right? Because we know we leave breadcrumbs everywhere, and Google and everybody is like trying to control us and give you an example, a result that they think you'll like. Don't want that. So I want you to start a new browser or be an incognito, something like that. DuckDuckGo is a great one that doesn't track you, but regardless, something that's not your default regular search engine. So I want to be more like some random person came in and typed in this search, okay? So more of a objective assessment about what the general public would see if the general public typed this in. And you will go and you'll type in literally natural disaster, and then there's going to be, again, volcano, whatever. And you're going to find several examples. Is it 6? Is it 6 or 8? I can't remember. It's some number, whatever is in there. And what I want you to do, here we go. Okay, so I have an example up here just to sort of show you what it looks like, the first one. But then, everybody's name is here. So you go scroll down to find your name. And then the first 6 are natural disaster and drought. The next 6 are act of God and drought. And the next person has the same pattern, but a different category of disaster. And you're going to find a news article or a blog post that talks about this, right? So we're not looking at an academic, we're not looking at like a textbook kind of thing or whatever. I don't want to look on social media. I want an actual story where people talk about stuff. And so I'm gonna put the title in here, boom. I'm gonna put a link to it. I'm gonna say who made it and when it was published and where it was located. And then there's some things over here to the right. So what was the ecosystem? It was talking about the urban landscape. It was talking about a coastline or whatever the heck it is. And then to the right, there's going to be other things. And is it a coastal or inland and all this and that? And for those other categories, where you'd put a check mark, you just put the number 1, and it'll make it easier for us to sum up. So in general, when we're doing these kinds of exercises, if something is like, yes, that's the category, don't put a check or an X, use the number 1, and that'll help us with doing a quick summary statistics at the end. Does that make sense? Okay, so everybody have a look at that. So everybody, if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you look on the announcements, there'll be a link to this Google document, and let's have at it. So it'll take a few minutes, and you guys can start to fill this in. So then, to just fill the one out then. Okay, so everybody have a look up here. So you guys can finish this tonight, and you guys are getting the idea. I just want to get you guys going so you sort of have our first stab and it makes sense. So here's what we're trying to do, right? So I've given everybody, so we've broken it out in terms of hurricanes and volcano, right? The common sort of descriptors. For some things that have many commonly used terms, and the classic one here, which again, we'll talk about this when we get to it, this is in a few weeks, but the classic one is, where is it? The classic one is right here. So hurricane, cyclone, typhoon, those are all exactly the same thing. But those are specific terms that we use where it is on the planet. So same phenomenon, same physics, same everything. But that's an example of something where if we just said hurricane, we're only going to get like the North American and sort of the North Pacific, kind of areas. And if we just say typhoon, we're just getting, so some of those, so that's why some of them I have some, it's the same sort of disaster phenomenon, but we have some different phrasing. So that's what that's about. But then here's what we're trying to do. So you guys are putting this all down, and then we're going to come over here, and this is the goal. The goal is, remember, do we associate things like act of God or disasters with certain areas over others? Now, of course, we're biased here because we're using English, right? And so whatever. Japan isn't going to be as represented in the English-speaking world, for example. But leaving that aside, the basic idea is: do we see any patterns with how we talk to ourselves about disasters, right? And so we're just starting this. We don't know yet because you guys are still filling it out, but you guys get the idea. So now we can start to look. Now, because disasters was the first category and you guys jumped in and started filling out disasters, almost nobody's gotten to act of God yet. So we have to wait for everybody to fill it out, but you guys get the idea. So this is suggesting that it looks fairly evenly between natural disasters we use for places that are far inland versus at the coast, okay? Over here, it looks like a lot of our stories are focusing on North America, right, relative to other regions of the world. And in terms of our ecosystems, it looks like a lot of beaches and coast and a lot of urban, but not like a lot of woodlands, not a lot of lakes, that kind of stuff. So that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to, everybody's got their little piece of the pie and everybody's grabbing stuff, and then we want to see, hey, is there a certain area where we use this term more than the others? And does it differ between natural disaster and act of God? So we might think that, something that happens far away, or maybe like a volcano, or whatever. Maybe people tend to use act of God for those kinds of things versus natural disasters. So we'll find out. That's the basic idea. Make sense? Okay, so let's finish that one, and then we're going to get back to what we're talking about. So let's keep going here. Okay, so our modern thinking of natural disasters really owes a lot to this devastation right here. This is in Nova Scotia, up in Canada, and we're looking at the wake of a disaster. In this case, it wasn't a natural disaster; it was a human tragedy. But basically, we had this warship. It was tied up at dock, and because they weren't properly handling the explosives went off. And because this was a military storage thing with lots and lots of stuff, instead of one bomb going off or one shell going off, it went off and ignited all these things. And so what we're looking at is, and this is in 1917, and so, World War I era, and essentially it just nuked this entire dock land, right? Just utter devastation. So it leveled buildings as far away as almost a kilometer, just straight up gone. It killed a little bit less than 2,000 people, but it hurt almost 10,000 people. And the number of people that were killed was about a fifth of this entire town. So this was a huge chunk of folks. When we talk about disasters, you'll often see this is one of our common currencies. How many folks died, how many folks were killed, how many structures were damaged. That's just, I kind of wish we had other default metrics, but those are the ones we have. And so and then also you'll get an estimate of the property destroyed. So usually we'll see a dollar amount associated with it. It would cause $1 billion worth of damage. So that's just how these events are usually articulated. Okay, one of the folks that came down to help all the hurt folks was a priest, and he responded, and he was really, really impacted, and this made a huge, it changed his whole life. He's like, oh my God, I got to do something to do this. So he basically went to school, went to Columbia, did a PhD, and is the first person to start to link social dynamics and risk. And so that's really the foundation for a lot of our modern thinking of disasters, how we conceptualize them, how we talk about planning and all that kind of stuff. And really that PhD dissertation becomes the foundation for much of our disaster thinking and how we management, the FEMA, all this kind of stuff. And so there are many, 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 but these are particularly important disasters that have strongly influenced how we think about disaster management, planning, response, etc. Of course, if we could spend the whole semester, adding to this, but these are some big ones. So I just want to run through them very, very briefly. We'll talk about several of these later in the semester. But the first real articulation in the Western world of a disaster really comes from Mount Vesuvius in Italy. And this description is by Pliny the Younger, because Pliny the Elder is killed in this eruption of this volcano. And this really does a lot of things. This starts the modern field of volcanology, studying how volcanoes, why do they erupt? Is there a frequency to them? All that kind of stuff. And so this is archaeologists are still excavating the area around this volcano to find history, to find clues as to how it happened, all that kind of stuff. That's Mount Vesuvius. Another one is these big series of earthquakes also in Italy. After the earthquakes happen, for the first time, we send a royal society with a bunch of scientists out to go and try to map what happened. Let's map it. Let's look at it. So it's sort of the birth of the modern, trying to bring the full scope of our scientific tools and approaches to understand what happened. Not quite 100 years later, this particular earthquake, just like the Vesuvius sort of starts the field of volcanology, this earthquake starts the field of seismology. Here in the U.S., one of the most important early disasters is the so-called Great Chicago Fire. You might have heard reference to this with the L.A. fires. In January of 2025, some people, particularly the firefighters, were making reference to the Great Chicago Fire. So a lot of us haven't really, I don't really know what that is. you might have heard the song, and she kicked the lantern over, and there'll be a hot town in the old town tonight. Fire, fire, fire. That's about this. But basically, a huge conflagration, huge giant fire destroyed a large chunk of the city of Chicago. And that really gets us into things like building codes, having fire departments, having fire hydrants. All those kinds of things come out of this 1871 fire. And I'll just note that one of the big pushes, if you watch that full press conference, is everybody's like, we should just be able to build. We shouldn't have to follow regulations, right? Totally understand where that comes from. Totally am sensitive to that, right? Bureaucracies can get in the way a lot of times. But we created these regulations because we saw how people were building without regulations, and they were leading to people dying, right? Okay, and then the famous Krakatoa eruption in Java. And this was a massive, massive explosion. This is one of the largest things we know of that has happened on Earth for several thousands of years. So this was heard around the world, this Southeast Asia eruption. It was insane. There's whole books written just on this one eruption. It was crazy. Galveston hurricane. This was before we started naming hurricanes. When we get into our hurricane lectures, we'll start talking about, like the Hurricane Katrina and all this. This was before we named the storm. So this is just known as the 1900 Galveston hurricane. It hit Galveston Island off the coast of Texas. Now, I'll probably make a lot of you angry because I am a Dallas Cowboys football fan. I know, how disappointing is that? I know. Dallas is where it is because of this. Houston, Texas is where it is because of this. This was the capital of Texas. This is where all the power was, well, not technically the capital, but this is where all the financial power was. This is where all the operas were. This is an offshore island, a very, very low elevation sand island. And this hurricane came up without warning, basically, and essentially erased the entire island. And it was so bad that even though we always hear after disasters, we're going to rebuild, the city founders and the big money interests are like, screw this, we're gone. And so they decamped. They went on land, and they went a little bit inland, and there already was a town called Houston, but they decided Houston's now our new it. And that's why Houston is now the 4th largest city in the U.S. This gave rise to modern meteorological forecasting and having stations, in this case throughout the Caribbean, to monitor when storms were coming in. The U.S. Weather Agency, all these things came out of this hurricane. Obviously, we have the San Francisco earthquake. We mostly think of that as in terms of the disaster is from the fire. So even though we all talk about the 1906 earthquake, really most of the death, most of the property destruction, all that kind of stuff came from the knock-on effect, the second part of the disaster. And we'll see this also, which is secondary disasters. Very, very common. So we start a flood, and then the flood breaks the gas lines, and the gas lines catch fire, and the gas lines start a fire, that kind of thing. So the 1906 earthquake. My family is all from San Francisco. I was born in San Francisco. So much of the landscape that I recognize was a consequence not of the original founding of the city, but of the city after 1906. We just talked about this. We just talked about that example of that explosion of munitions up in Canada. That really, as I mentioned, kicks off the modern field of sort of modern disaster management and this and that. The 1927 Mississippi River floods. This is one of our first modern examples of something happening to essentially a whole chunk of the country, more or less at once. Massive rains, massive flooding, massive jumping of the river out of its main channel into floodplains and causing all kinds of problems. That gives rise to things like Hoover Dam and all the dam control structures that we spent a century building, and now we're spending billions of dollars to try to remove, because we know that was a fool's errand for the most part. And then the last one here is the Dust Bowl, which is something we don't often talk about in ESRM, but it probably was the most impactful environmental catastrophe that we've had in our country, certainly in the last 100 or so years. And so this was essentially massively bad farming practices, people taking farming practices from Europe and try to apply them in the Great Plains, tilling up soil, destroying the soil structure, destroying the plants that keep the soil in place, exposing them, and then having a series of, then entering into a drought period where essentially that topsoil blows away. So it's called the Dust Bowl because essentially we're turning much of the soil into airborne particles, and we're just covering huge swaths of the country. That gives rise to things like the Soil Conservation Service and all kinds of stuff. Okay. All right. There are several different frameworks for talking about how disasters progress and evolve. It's best to think of them as not a start point A and end at point B, but rather a feedback loop. They are always a cycle. It's not as if we start somewhere and end. We're always somewhere in the disaster recovery cycle. Right. Okay. And so some people have this as 3 phases. Some people have it as 4. Some have it as 5. I don't particularly care, but the main thing is the ideas here. And for help us to start, we'll start here just to give us a place. Again, we mentioned it's a sort of a continuous cycle, but we've got to start somewhere. Let's start with mitigation. So here are those cycles. So sometimes people have prevention as a separate thing, but mitigation is trying to prevent future events, or if we know we just can't prevent them, when they do happen, put things in place so that when they happen, they're not as bad as they otherwise would be. So try to minimize the impact. That's the mitigation phase. And that would be things like building codes. That would be things like policies for how to take large animals to where we're going to evacuate the horses, and like that sort of level of stuff that we're talking about. It could also mean having things like our sewage system not at sea level. Maybe not putting our desalination plant right in the path of the hurricane, right? So that's like sort of large scale planning. Let's make us less vulnerable. Okay. And the preparedness is saying like, okay, it's going to happen, so let's get ready. So that's going to be stockpiling masks, stockpiling sandbags, give everybody first aid training, that kind of stuff. Then the event happens, the disaster happens, boom. And then the very first part is response. And you'll find, and you're hearing this in with the LA fires now, this is a really important distinction. Really important. So response is helicopter pilots flying around trying to pull people out of buildings. Response is putting out the fire. Response is actively stopping the badness and actively finding survivors and helping them, right? And maybe stabilizing the bank so like it doesn't slide onto PCH or something like that. And then once we have done that immediate response, once we've got the fire out, once we got everybody to the hospital and all that kind of jazz, then at some point the response phase is formally declared over. And all the firefighters go back home, and all the helicopter pilots go back home, and Red Cross and people like that, they don't necessarily, Red Cross doesn't necessarily go away, but they staff down, right? And then recovery is when we do put the house back up and rebuild the highway and that kind of stuff. So mitigation, preparedness, boom, it happens, and then we do response and recovery. The main actors that are going to play a role here in the U.S. for our disasters are first and foremost FEMA, despite the fact that our current president wants to delete it. Because as he said in the press conference, it was great when he did it, but now it's horrible. So we should probably just delete it, in his own words. I don't think we're going to delete FEMA. But this is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It was formally codified by Jimmy Carter. And it wasn't like a de novo creation. Rather, it was assembling other parts of the federal government that already existed for the most part, but just putting them under one central roof to make them more efficient and make them be able to talk to each other more easily and stuff. Okay, so we have FEMA, which is the federal actor. Then we have state governments. Then we have local governments. That could be county, that could be city. And then, super important, we have people like you and I that are local folks, either that are part of the disaster or that come over to help the folks with the disaster. And this is fundamental. This is most of our service learning courses to Maui, to New Orleans, and all that kind of stuff is basically that's where we plug in. Gesundheit, or we're actually a bit wider. And so then there's a whole network of people that aren't maybe in the immediately affected area, but they provide masks. They provide food for animals. They provide, sort of networks of NGOs, basically. So those are the main actors when we have a disaster happen. As I said before, if we talk about the cycles, the prevention/mitigation phase is really about anything that's going to try to either stop not allow the disaster to happen in the first place, or it's going to say it's going to happen, but we're going to try to minimize what it's going to do. And this is all well before, long term before the event happens, right? Years, if not decades. The preparedness is on the very specific things for what to do, like on that day or as the event unfolds. And this is really about immediate survivorship of people and/or integrity of infrastructure. The response is how we save people. So how we have individuals responding, how we have different government units. So we have the emergency response center in places like county governments that help coordinate the disaster response. That's all response. And it's so the first couple days are really, really key, because if someone is buried underneath rubble or is burned or something like that, we need to get those people to emergency care. Or if it's inclement weather, we need to get them to shelter. Otherwise, they're probably not going to make it. All right. So while response can last more than that immediate window, that very, very first window is just about keeping people alive, right? Keeping people alive, keeping people alive, keeping people alive. And then the recovery is the phase that takes a long time. And this is how we recover from the impacts of the disaster. Importantly, in recent years, we've come to see this also as trying to minimize secondary disasters. So these disasters have extremely long tails. So we say, how many people died? And we count how many body bags we used, right? In reality, there's many more people suffer than we first measure, either in terms of broken bones or in terms of lost life. And that's because the incredible stress that these situations place people in, financial stress, relationship stress, marital stress, financial stress, all these things play out over a long time. So we'll see a lot of increase in domestic violence after these things. We'll see a lot of more poor performing students in local schools because they're stressed out, all that kind of stuff. So recovery, in addition to just rebuilding, is also trying to sort of short circuit some of these knock-on effects that we now recognize are very, very common. Could also be other health effects, maybe making sure people aren't going into houses with mold and we give them proper respirators so they don't develop lung problems or stuff like that. Okay, one more key thing, as I mentioned before, another really important aspect about many of our disasters, not all, but many, is there's the initial thing and then there's the other part, right? So we break that into the primary and secondary impacts. in this case, this was a hurricane that struck, a big storm that struck the coast of Peru. So there was a, sorry, I said hurricane, that's not right, a tsunami. So there was a eruption. That volcanic eruption shook the ground. Volcanoes or earthquakes can cause tsunamis. So we have this big sort of wave that comes in, and the wave goes into this part of the coast and breaks up some of the oil holding structures and cause an oil spill, right? So we have the primary disaster that then, leads to this other disaster, which in and of itself might be a whole problem just by itself, but now we're managing two different types of impacts. We don't need to spend a huge amount of time on this. This is more important, I think, for conceptual. But there's a very clear arc that we often go through when it comes to this stuff. And so in this case, this is like a qualitative scale. This wasn't like directly measured every single little part, but it serves to make the point. And so in this case, we're talking about the emotional health, the emotional well-being of victims. And this is sort of a generic-y kind of version here. So we start, let's say we have a hurricane that strikes, let's say. So initially, you and I are pretty stoked. We're kind of normal people, and we're generally happy and that kind of stuff. And then we start hearing that, in some cases, if it's an earthquake, we don't get a warning. But in some disasters, we get, oh my gosh, the fire is coming, red flag warning, the hurricane forecast, right? So we start to hear that, and we start to get a little stressed out and worried and scared. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And then the thing happens, and then everybody writes stories. Humans are so great. We all bond together, and we're all just great people, right? And all the great heroic stories that people get saved. So there's kind of like oh man, thank God that my house is destroyed, but at least my family's alive, that kind of stuff, right? And that spikes pretty quickly. And then also, once you're through that sort of adrenaline rush, it then tends to tank pretty quickly as well. So I'm super stoked my family's okay, but now I'm like, oh crap, how am I gonna pay for bills? I have no house, and like that kind of stuff. So then it kind of crashes down. And then there's this sort of period of up and down where people maybe are getting a little bit better, and then it's their parents' anniversary and they realize we've lost all the wedding albums, or whatever it is. There's all these triggers that just, and then people get all sad again. And so it's kind of up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And through a series, it might take months, it might take years, we eventually get back to sort of that place that we were before. But this path is almost universal. Not entirely universal, but it's very, very common. Some people, this will be compressed and happen quicker, but this general pattern seems to happen to many, many folks that experience a significant disaster. And again, I'll just say that we're running out of time, so I'll skip this part. But suffice it to say that there's things that happen instantly and some things that take time to play out. And I'll just say that for the sake of time. In particular, while everybody is harmed, and we need to remember this, the rich person, the person with all the resources, with no resources, everybody is harmed. Everybody is hurting. Everybody needs a hand. Everybody needs compassion. But having said that, there are particular groups that are usually more vulnerable to disruptions when we have these disasters. And in particular, that tends to be elderly folks. They can't move as much. They don't have as many resources. They don't have cell phones that get the early warning kind of thing. Disabled, so folks that need extra help moving around. They can't evacuate as easily and things like that. People that just generally don't have access to as many resources. Maybe they don't own a car, that kind of stuff to get out of harm's way kind of thing. And then in our country, in particular, non-English speakers. So a lot of our communication, for understandable reasons, is in English. It's not always in other languages, so it's not always available to other folks in terms of warnings, in terms of preparation, in terms of where to go after the disaster hits, etc. Yeah, I think we'll come back to that because we're running out of time. Okay, so the last thing here, I just want to end with our last little bit with our activity. So that we did the first tab, that's one part. The second part, I want to talk about it. And so those are disaster myths. We have a gazillion disaster myths. So these are just a few of them. So People are going to panic. It's going to be mass chaos after the wildfire, after the earthquake, after the whatever. You hear that a lot. Disasters bring out the worst in us. We got to watch out for looters, right? The guys in Malibu are out there with their guns because they're manly and they're going to stop the bad looters, right? We always hear this kind of stuff as if you know. And with all these things, some of this stuff occasionally happens. But I'm talking about the general myths that people talk about before the event even happens or early on in the event. You'll often hear about there's a lone firefighter, such a good hero, saved everybody. Or similarly, that evil bastard at the water company didn't turn the knob to make the water flow, right? We seem to really love to have a single Han Solo rebel hero that defied the rules and saved the dog. And similarly, there's a bad guy. Both are misleading, right? We also have this thing that survivors are just passive. Survivors sit around. They're waiting for a handout. If we don't give them aid, they're not going to do anything. Another one is that diseases are just inevitable. Once we have a really, really bad disaster, and if the water system is contaminated, of course everybody's going to get sick. Another is that things are going to be normal pretty quickly. Yep, a few weeks, a month or two, we'll be back to normal. You'll hear that a lot. You're hearing that a lot right now. And then you'll hear this one also. We got to get back. We got to build back real quick. Got to get like it was before, right? Even though we might just be just as vulnerable to the same disaster. But we got to repeat exactly what we had before. I got to rebuild my house the same way. You better allow me to have my permit to build my house because I want to build my house. That kind of thing. That there's a lot of fraud in the recovery thing. We shouldn't give these poor people money because these people are going to steal it. Increasingly, this used to be very rare. Increasingly, this is becoming the norm. This was all over like day one of LA fires. Conspiracy. Oh, these people are setting fires. Oh, it's space lasers. Oh, it's all this kind of stuff. You also hear that outsiders are coming up, stealing our property, buying our property when we're most vulnerable. Everybody always says that. No one knew. Who could have known? You mean like the paper I read last week, the presentation I gave 2 years ago to the insurance, state insurance, Western insurance commissioners? Tick, 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 tick. Oh, really? Nobody knew? Really? Insurance will make you whole. Ha, 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 ha. Right? Not even close. And maybe there's some other ones that you guys have you guys heard any other disasters that maybe don't fall into one of those bins? Okay, well, if you guys think of more, you guys can tell me. Okay, so this one is our last one, right? Is our last activity. So I want you to help me and see what's going on with this. So just like we're asking about, doing that survey before, we're doing the same thing this time, but this time we're saying we're slightly different. Let's look at our sheet. So in this case, we're going to click on something about my Zoom is weird on this thing right here. So in this case, we're going to go to the second tab. So you guys were on tab 1, Act of God. We're going to go to the second one. And again, I have everybody's name up here, right? And so you're going to search for, again, just like before, incognito, DuckDuckGo, stuff that's not your generic browser kind of thing. But I want you guys to search for, so check it out. Here are all those myths. Those myths are outlined. This one says people are going to panic. Looting is common. So I want you to find some news stories that reference, or blog posts that reference this, okay? And so everybody has a couple different ones, right? And so, Mia, you're going to go, okay, people panic. You're going to find this one. And just like before, you're going to fill it out. A couple things here, Gesundheit. One is just tell us, is it like a just immediate news story? So a lot of stuff is just like as it's happening. So, a very short story. It's a short video story. It's a short news story, but it's just a blurb. Versus some stories will be a deeper look, right? Trying to like understand patterns and not just about a crisis reporting from the field, but trying to give us a little more context. So tell us if you think it's a brief news story or a deeper one. And then just like before, fill these guys out. And then just like over here on the right, you're going to do the tick marks again.